Okay, it's 1 o'clock, so I think we should probably get started. I wanted to let you know, I appreciate all of you being here today. There's a lot of information that we want to talk about. This is the training called Supporting People Who Have Been Diagnosed with Mental Illness. Again, just as a reminder, please sign into the chat if you haven't already. It's nice to be able to see a lot of familiar names in the chat, so welcome everybody. I'm glad you're able to attend today. With me today is Paul Margulies, and he works for the Center for Practice Innovations through Columbia University, and he is here to provide the clinical aspect of mental illness, the first part of our training today, to talk about a lot of different topics. I'll just leave it at that. Let him talk about that. And the end of that training today is going to be about OMH and how we can get you connected to various OMH programs. And so I will go ahead and share the screen and we will jump right in. Okay, Paul, can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great.
Okay. Did I just inadvertently do that, Lisa?
No, I did that.
Oh, you did it. Okay. Should we get rolling?
Yes, let's do.
Excellent. So welcome, everybody. As Lisa says, I'm Paul Margulies from the Center for Practice Innovations. I'm delighted to be with you here today. And I appreciate the fact that you're spending time with us. I know you have just a few other things to be doing with your time. So for you to put an hour and a half out of a busy afternoon to spend time with us is so much appreciated. I'm looking at the attendance. My gosh, we've got over 80 people with us. This is fantastic. And hopefully we'll be able to raise some interesting points and give you some interesting information, and most importantly, make a difference in the work that you do. I have some information I'm going to present, and Lisa does as well, but beyond that, we'd love to use the chat box to do the best we can in this kind of a platform to have a bit of a conversation. And you'll see some slides that queue up some questions we'll have for you. So let's look at the agenda. It's a big one, as you can see. And I'll very quickly walk through the various topics here. First, we're going to start by identifying the issue, and the issue comes out of conversations that Lisa and I and others have had with Department of Labor staff and administrators and such. And so first, we're going to make sure we're all on the same page with what the issue is. Then we want to hear from you around what your experiences and concerns are and have been in working with people who have been diagnosed with a serious mental illness or who have symptoms that seem to be the symptoms of a mental illness. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the myths that are related to people who are diagnosed with mental illness. And there are so many myths, you will see 2 full slides filled with them that we'll talk about. We're going to talk about a very important topic of stigma and how it impacts, first of all, what it is, and then how it impacts our expectations in our work with people who've been diagnosed with a serious mental illness and how we interact with them. We're going to talk about a concept called recovery, which may be familiar to some, but perhaps not to others. And we're going to talk about, what this concept has to do with your work and what it has to do with the lives of the people with whom you're working who've been diagnosed with a mental illness. And then we're going to focus in on employment, which is, clearly the major point for today. We're going to talk about how to begin the conversation with an individual related to employment and mental illness. Lisa's going to talk a lot about available resources for you, and there is so much stuff out there. And we'll have time for questions and answers and discussion, at the end, as well as I'm sure as we go along. So that's what we're aiming to accomplish in the next 90 minutes or so. Okay, next slide, please. So here's the issue. Disability resource coordinators and other Department of Labor staff, we know at times support the efforts of people who've been diagnosed with mental illness, or at least exhibiting mental health symptoms. And they help them to find and keep meaningful jobs. We know that's happening. There are times when these people, when their diagnoses and histories are known to the DRCs and other staff, and times when they aren't. Some people have raised concerns about working closely with these individuals, with anxieties about their symptoms, their ability to follow through, and even violence. So there are concerns out there. So let's start a little conversation using the chat box. Please use the chat box to describe your experiences with people who've been diagnosed with mental illness or exhibiting mental health symptoms. What are the challenges? What are your accomplishments? What do you feel good about? And also, what anxieties and worries do you have? Let's start with where you're at. So we're going to give you a little bit of time to type up into the chat box. Please don't be shy. We do want to kind of center today's webinar on where you're at and what your experiences are and have been. And I think we just need one person to break the ice and we can get rolling. So if somebody has the is willing to do some sharing. Here we go. Lots of stuff coming in. I worry about where I refer them to. Great, positive, challenging, rewarding all at the same time. Thank you, Scott. I want to make sure when working with an older adult that they feel supported and respected. Wonderful. Understanding how completing the New York Scion tab helps them. Resistance of customer and acknowledging mental health issues. We'll get to that. This is good. With or without a diagnosis. Many of them are not aware that they have some sort of mental illness. People are resisting help. Some people don't disclose a mental illness. So we have a theme already here, Lisa. We have several customers whose behaviors are erratic, which causes staff to change on the fly, and it creates added problems in truly helping them. Young people with needs who leave school and what happens to continue services for them. More help with referrals. We're going to get that today for sure. Where to refer? Yeah, referrals. I work in a career center in Brooklyn. Who do you bring up? Who do you bring up the subject of mental illness with a customer as clearly has symptoms but doesn't know? Okay, it's moving so quickly now. This is great, but I'm losing some of this. Many are not aware of how it impacts them and are confused how it impacts employment. We're going to get into that. This is good. They tend to blame, shift more and more, and not take responsibility. My background is as a mental health counselor, so I feel comfortable. Angela tells us individuals with SMI can thrive like anyone else. Angela, you just summarized about 10 of our slides. Thank you for that. And we will get to that in some detail. I've not had any customers on an individual basis, but those coming to use our resource room, sometimes we would not know. Sure. And that's okay. Struggling with consistency. I'm just jumping around here a little bit. Most people are without treatment, including med management or regular sessions. I've worked with youth and young adults who may have diagnosed mental health conditions or symptoms like anxiety, depression, trauma-related responses, attention challenges. I focus on person-centered planning, consistent engagement, and strengths-based approaches. Matthew just summarized another 10 slides. Excellent. I worry about the over-criminalization of mental health symptoms and how this could impact folks if they display behaviors in public offices. Good point, Joshua. Staff response to erratic behavior. Some individuals with disabilities do not believe they can work. We're going to pick up on that one in a big way. Thank you for that. That's Rebecca. Being patient and coming to terms with working with individuals with mental health challenges will take time. It will not be a quick encounter. I serve people who are incarcerated and provide them with job readiness training. They all have trauma, but the mental health issue does not exist in a vacuum. Systemic racism, economic oppression, lack of education, societal inequality, so forth. Martha, you're right on the money with this. I'd like to better serve my customers in an intersectional way. Thank you for that. My primary concern in this type of work relates to ensuring that individuals receive timely, appropriate supports. Yeah, I'm attentive to the risk of participants disengaging due to barriers like transportation, fluctuations in mental health service delays. And Angela, is a good way to wrap it up. Mental health is for everyone. It's important that everyone maintains their mental health. And I think that's a great way to stop. Thank you, everybody. Lisa, this was great. Lots of participation. It's wonderful. Thank you, everybody. It's really important that, Lisa, I know kind of where you're at, because we want to make sure that what we have to say, is helpful to you in the situations you find yourself in. So if I could summarize maybe all that we've been reading here and something that we didn't get to, there are a wide variety of experiences and challenges, as well as feelings of accomplishment, and some concerns that have been raised, and also some folks who've had really fine experiences. And so, it's good. This is good. Okay, next slide, please. So there are a ton of myths about people with mental illness. And so we're going to read a few of them now, and then have some questions for you. And so one myth, and the reason why we're calling these myths is by definition, they're not true. And although some of this may be true about any one given individual, as a group of people, these statements just haven't been found to be true. So let's kind of go through them. Unable to get better and move on with their lives, which is kind of the way when I entered the field too many decades ago to say, that was the prevailing wisdom. That was the belief among mental health professionals, recipients of care, their families, everybody. That was the belief. Unpredictability and violence. Violence is a big fear and a big myth. I mean, the data that's out there is very interesting. I don't know if folks are aware of this, but somebody who's been diagnosed with a serious mental illness is much more likely to be the victim of violence than the perpetrator, overwhelmingly so. Unable to follow through and maintain commitments, not motivated, better off in hospitals and day programs. Next slide, please. Here are more myths. Working is too stressful will lead to relapse. Let me give you a quick example of that, which is actually not true. When I began in the field quite some time ago, I was running a clinic, and the folks we were serving, for the most part, were diagnosed with serious mental illness. If somebody came in at an intake and said that they wanted to work, our response was wait 6 months. Let's make sure you can handle it, because work is very stressful and can be toxic and can result in your having a relapse. That's flat out what we told people, and we believed that to be true at the time. And so if somebody was really interested in working, what do you think happened? They never came back. If they were willing to hang in there with us, within 6 months, we had thoroughly beaten out of them any desire to work, and I'm not proud about that. That's the way the field was for a very, very long time. And as we move along with today's webinar, you'll see that it just isn't the reality. It certainly isn't the reality nowadays. Another myth, most people diagnosed with mental illness are too sick to work. We'll talk about that. We have data that we can share from the New York State experience that really says something else. Working will result in loss of benefits, and Lisa has tremendous expertise around this, and I guess what we can say in the short run, Lisa, can't we, is not necessarily true, right?
Yep.
That's just not the case, although so many of us believe that to be the case. There aren't a lot of jobs out there for people diagnosed with mental illness. Our experience in doing the work that I'll describe to you in a little while is that's actually not true at all. There are tremendous numbers of jobs out there. People won't hire these individuals because of their symptoms. Another myth. And even if they can get a job, they can't keep it. So these are all the myths that are out there. They are believed by a great many mental health professionals, a great many rehab counselors, a great many family members, and many of the people who have the diagnoses themselves. They're not true. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've already spoken to this. The answer is they're really not, which is not to say for a given person something might not be true there. But generally speaking, not the case. And Lisa, as I'm reading, if there's anything that comes up in the chat box you want to highlight, feel free to just, to do so.
Okay.
So the idea here is that there's a lot of misinformation out there, and it has been the case for generations as it relates to people who have a serious mental illness and want to work. And by the way, just as an aside, there's been a lot of surveys done around this over the years, and we can use a chat box for this. Does anybody want to guess? Feel free to write up in the chat box. What percentage of people who've been diagnosed with a serious mental illness want a real job in the real world? Anybody want to take a guess? No harm done if you get it wrong. 60%, 100%, 90%, 99, 90. You guys are there. The general surveys is about 2/3 of the people, up to about 70%. So you're all in the right ballpark. The takeaway from that is a lot of people with serious mental illness diagnoses truly want to work. Then the question is, what percentage of people with those diagnoses truly do work, have and keep jobs? Anybody want to guess that? And sadly, this number has not moved in the generation, despite all of our efforts. Yes, Elizabeth got it on the nose. It's about 15%. So we have an issue here. If maybe 70% or more people want to be working and only about 15% are working, that's an enormous discrepancy. And the work that we've been doing in New York State, that Lisa's group and the group that I work with have been doing, is to try to really, bridge that gap. Okay, next slide, please. So let's talk about stigma. Stigma is a big deal, and so we're going to spend a little time dwelling on this. So here's the dictionary definition. It's a set of negative and unfair beliefs that a society or a group of people have about something. Next slide, please. Stigma is a major issue for people who have been diagnosed with a mental illness. It's fueled by the myths we just covered. It's enormously strong in our society. It results in assumptions and beliefs that are just not true or accurate. And it obviously works against the interests of the people who have these diagnoses. That said, it's endorsed, it can be endorsed by employers, by coworkers, by family, by mental health practitioners, and others in the helping professions. So, those of us in the mental health field can buy into, stigma just as much as others can. And then there's this very, very powerful concept called self-stigma. What does that mean? It means people who have a diagnosis buy into all these stigmatizing beliefs about themselves. And what it does is it results in these folks having great difficulty finding the courage to move ahead with their life goals, whether it's employment, whether it's finding a relationship, whether it's going back to school, whether it's moving out into a more independent way of living. The folks who really buy into self-stigma don't have a lot of belief in themselves, and we see it a lot. Okay, next slide, please. Another chat box question. Please tell us about stigma towards people diagnosed with mental illness or their self-stigma that you yourself have witnessed or felt in your work. What did you see? What happened? What didn't happen? What was its impact? We'll give you a few minutes to type up. I can't type fast enough. I agree. Try your best. We will give you time. Don't worry. They do get treated differently when they disclose. They are not capable of holding on to a job. That's the stigma out there. That's the belief. Family members have an impact and stigma on an individual with a disability. The individual moved or got a job, or moved out or got a job. Another belief is they can't continuously show up to work, unemployable. Belief that everybody needs medication, it does impact their confidence. Customers feeling hopeless and defeated, unwilling to keep trying and take any risks. Maybe that is in part the self-stigma. Yes, it is. And you know, this issue of taking risks, and we emphasize this a lot in the training we do, it takes a lot of courage for somebody who's had difficulties with serious mental illness to say, hey, I want different. I want more. I'd like to work. I believe I can work. It takes a lot of courage. And part of what we do in our work is support that and nurture that courage and support it. Because it's much easier for all of us to throw the towel in and not bother, right? It really takes a lot of courage. I see people that are capable, that are discriminated against, and people who are unrealistic about what they can do. The belief that they're not stable and reliable. Customers who often seem to understate the impact of their condition. Having discussions to help them identify and accept how it impacts them is one step to getting them help. Resources available. Elizabeth writes something that's very troubling. It was disturbing that a mental health professional told me mental health patients never get well. That is a very disturbing illustration of the stigma that's out there in our field. They are messed up or crazy, can't be helped, not dependable, employable. Those are the myths that are out there. That's the stigma. People refuse to work with the person because they believe the person was unmotivated and unstable. So, Lisa, it appears to me that lots of the folks typing up have encountered, have experienced, have seen this kind of stigma and the self-stigma. Yeah. Okay. We'll move along. Thank you, folks, for typing up. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about a concept called recovery. And I don't know if this is familiar to anybody here out of the, how many people do we have here now? Out of the 120 people we have here. That's
Wow.
fantastic. That is just fantastic. I don't know how many are familiar with this concept, but I'm going to walk through some basics, which is very important for you to be aware of. And I have a couple of quotes here. William Anthony, who passed away about a decade ago, was a psychologist who developed an approach called psychiatric rehabilitation, which to this very day, and this is about 40 years ago, to this very day, this is a very, very important approach in the rehabilitation and treatment of folks with a serious mental illness. So important that the New York State Office of Mental Health is now in the 4th year of a massive initiative bringing psychiatric rehabilitation to mental health agencies. So Bill Anthony says this: recovery involves the development of new meaning and purpose in one's life as one grows beyond the catastrophic effects of mental illness. New meaning and purpose. Pat Deegan, Patricia Deegan, and once again, I don't know if folks are familiar with Pat. Pat is a woman who was diagnosed with serious mental illness as a teenager. Didn't let that stop her. Went on and got a PhD in clinical psychology after spending years in state hospitals in Massachusetts, and is now one of the most important thought leaders in our field. She's had a major impact on the way in which treatment and rehabilitation and practitioners' attitudes have evolved over the years. So Pat says recovery refers to the lived, real-life experience of persons as they accept and overcome the challenge of disability. So you begin to get a little feel for this. Next slide, please. The next slide is the federal government, SAMHSA, a process of change through which individuals improve their health and wellness, live a self-directed life, I want to come back to that one, and strive to reach their full potential. Now, this idea of a self-directed life, you would never have heard of, 20, 30, 40 years ago. The idea that somebody, even though they have a diagnosis like schizophrenia or a bipolar disorder or a severe personality disorder, that they are in a position and are capable of making decisions about what they want in their lives, what their goals are, what their likes are, what their dislikes are, and being in the driver's seat of their life. That's a profound shift in our field. And this recovery perspective has really helped to support this, over the years. It's a profound shift. Next slide, please. Once again, Pat Deegan. Here's some good news, and this is true, and there are tons of studies that show this. Pat said, long-term studies have consistently found that half to two-thirds of people diagnosed with major mental illness go on to a significant or complete recovery. Data show that even in the second or third decade, a person can still go on to a complete recovery. It really is quite something. And I'll give you kind of a modern illustration of that. There was a time not that long ago when if a person was having a first episode of, say, schizophrenia, they'd wind up in the hospital for a fairly long period of time and then wind up being discharged to a day hospital or a day treatment program or such, where they'd basically be hanging out all day without a whole lot to do, heavily monitored, surrounded by people who share that diagnosis. And you can imagine what happens under those circumstances. Here, the person is in their late teens, early to mid-20s, and what happens is very quickly they give up hope. And so the idea that they can move on and have a life that they can be in the driver's seat on, back in those days, in those circumstances, was really, not something that they were exposed to. I want to contrast that with new programs that have been developed over the course of the past 20 years for people having what's known as the first episode, of psychosis. And these programs are very active in getting people all sorts of treatment and rehabilitation very quickly after they've had their first episode, including supported employment and education. And the data for these programs is fascinating. Within 6 to 9 months after a young person enters this program, close to 70% of those people is back in work or school. So contrast that to the old days where they'd be languishing in a day room, probably smoking a lot of cigarettes without much hope. And so what this gets at is, as we are changing the kinds of treatment and rehabilitation that we're offering people, the trajectories of their lives, the course of their lives, we're seeing changes dramatically. And employment is a very important part of all of this. We didn't include slides here that show you many studies that support what Pat Deegan is saying here, but the studies are out there both in this country as well as around the world. Okay, next slide, please. So here are some values that are very important, some of which showed up in the chat box already. Probably the most important value is hope. Hope that the person in front of you can move on with their lives and have a life that's meaningful and that they have a say in. And I go back to that quote that we read about 10 minutes ago. Somebody was saying in the chat box that a mental health professional was saying these people never move on. That's not about recovery. So hopefulness is extremely important. And that comes along with the potential for growth and change. A diagnosis does not, at this point, imprison somebody, in a life that can't move on and have growth and have meaning. This value of being person-driven, which we talked about a few minutes ago, that really is the individual who is in the driver's seat of the bus of their life, if you will. And we are there to sit next to them and provide guidance and support and, even some advice. But they're in the driver's seat of their life. We're not. But this rests upon the belief that a person with a diagnosis such as schizophrenia can be in the driver's seat of their life. And overwhelmingly, the research and the experience in the field is they actually can. And that, leads to the next issue there of choice and empowerment as a value. And I'll just, in the employment realm, I'll just do a little bit of a tangent just to show how important this is. Back in the days of traditional vocational rehabilitation, and once again, with the 100+ people here, I'm sure at least some of us are familiar with those days. Oftentimes, people weren't given a lot of choice in the jobs that are available to them. They may not even have had the option of having a competitive job. They may have been told they need to go to a sheltered workshop, or they need to go to some business that's run by the agency, and not really being given the opportunity for a job just like the rest of us can have. Is it any surprise that for many of the people in that situation, they weren't terribly motivated about where we sent them? Any surprise? If you think back on our own lives, if any of us have been in that situation where we got told that we had to, take a job that we didn't really want, we tend not to be motivated. We tend maybe not even to show up so much and that sort of thing. And back in those days, that was then viewed as a quality, a characteristic of the illness. They don't stick with things. You can't count on them. They're not motivated. They're good, today they're motivated, 3 weeks from now, what happened? And I would maintain that's the way most of us operate when we're being pigeonholed into something we're not terribly motivated about. On the other hand, if a person is helped to choose a job that's meaningful and that reflects what's important to them, and then supported in that job, they're tremendously motivated. And I can tell you stories for the next hour about that. It all has to do with the circumstances and whether the person is empowered to make decisions around, in this case, where they're going to work, or whether they're told what to do. Okay, other values about recovery, being holistic. So what does that mean? That means that a person, and this is true for all of us, this has nothing to do with having a diagnosis, that a person's mental health and their physical health and their use of substances are all connected. And you can't treat one without really dealing with all of them. There was a time where somebody had both a mental health and a substance use problem, they'd get 2 different treatment approaches at 2 different agencies at the same time. Didn't work. Didn't work at all. Because each was treating a part of the person and none of it was really integrated. Nowadays, more and more, based upon very good research, the field is moving towards integrated treatment, where the mental health and the substance use, and now the physical health, the medical health, are all available under the same roof. And all those practitioners are collaborating with each other. That's about recovery. Okay, respect is another recovery value, respecting the individual, but so is their personal responsibility. We provide support when it's needed, but there's also an expectation the person's going to take some responsibility. And you know what happens? When that's the expectation, people typically do. We could have the next slide. You know what, Lisa, can we go back again to the previous slide for a moment? And I just want to see if people have reactions to what we're saying. Do you agree with us? Do you disagree? Do these values resonate with you? Do they feel just alien and weird and don't make any sense? I'm just curious if people can type up. How do you feel about empowerment, person-driven? Sounds good to me, makes sense, resonates with my experience, says Martha. I agree, says Angela. Some of them truly do, but I have concerns about empowerment. That's not unusual. It takes time to begin to see how empowerment makes a difference. And I want to come back and talk about empowerment in a moment. These are the values that we need to ensure they understand these values. Makes sense. I agree. Okay, so we're seeing a lot of agreement, at least among those that are typing up, you know. There's no recovery out there. Yeah. So let me tell you something. This is my perspective. There's no research behind it whatsoever. But let me say something and see what you'll think about this. I would maintain in some ways that in our system, even before there was such a thing as recovery and there was such a thing as, you know, all the kinds of things we're talking about today, in many ways, people were always empowered. And I'll give you an example. I could remember, once again, a long time ago, when people were told what medications to take. It was dictated to them. It was prescribed. And you know how people showed their empowerment? They didn't take it. People were told to go to programs. You know how they showed their empowerment? By not going to the programs. People always had the ability to make decisions for themselves. The issue here is how we can help people to make these kinds of decisions and empower themselves towards their personal recovery and growth and such. And that doesn't mean we don't have a role when we're empowering people, right? You're professionals, you have points of view, right? And so you certainly are in a position to share your perspectives. And to the extent that you have a trusting relationship with the individual, they'll listen. They might very well listen. What we don't have a right to do, you know, is really impose that on people without their buy-in. And I know there are some exceptions to that when people are a danger to themselves and others and that sort of thing, but that's very rare. I like this one from Elizabeth. Maybe the question to the person is, how do you want to show your empowerment over your life? I like that. And see, Laura says, somebody once told me part of an employment counselor's job was to hold the customer's motivation until they were able to take it up. And that's really nicely put. That's really, because we should not have an expectation that any of us, and once again, this has nothing to do with the mental health diagnosis, none of us have consistent motivation around anything, right? It comes and it goes. We don't know what else is going on. All labor intervention should be strictly non-judgmental. I like that from Ken. This is great. Okay, moving on. Thank you, folks. This is great. Next slide. So let's talk about recovery and employment. So the focus is on competitive employment for people diagnosed with serious mental illness. What is a competitive employment? It's a real job in the real world, just like everybody else. It's having a job that is open to everybody, not just somebody with a disability or with a mental health problem. That's competitive employment. As opposed to what was done in the past where people were segregated and in a mental health ghetto, and the only jobs that were available were jobs for those with a diagnosis. This is about real jobs in the real world. And part of it, you know, is about employment and money, right? But part of it is also about a concept they call social inclusion, about being out there in the real world with people. Makes all the difference. And then there's the New York State Employment First Initiative, which we can probably talk about for hours, but Suffice for now for you to know that this is something from the state government. You know, the underpinning of it is that anybody who wants to work can work, and there are supports that are available to make that happen. Then there's individual placement and support employment. That is the evidence-based practice. That's what the research shows works. And that is the practice that my center teaches mental health practitioners to provide support to them, for them to implement. And it makes a difference. This is an approach that's been around since about 30 years, 35 years. It's very different than traditional vocational rehabilitation, and the best way to summarize it is this. If somebody with a mental health diagnosis wants a job, what we do is we find them the job that's meaningful to them, and we wrap supports around them so they can keep the job. It's really that simple, as opposed to the traditional way of doing things with tons of evaluations and tons of hoops to jump through. And first you start as a volunteer, and then you move on to, you know, maybe an internship, and then you move on to maybe, you know, a job with some employer who likes people with mental illness. And then by the time you finish all of that, very few people wind up with competitive employment. It just doesn't happen. In one of the initiatives that I oversee at the Center for Practice Innovations, we're working with people, with agencies, both clinics run by the state hospital system in New York, as well as a community psychiatric rehabilitation program approach called PROS, which stands for Personalized Recovery-Oriented Services. We're working in that initiative with, last count, I think it's 111 sites. It's a lot of people. Each month, roughly 50% of the people who are getting the service are working in real jobs. Pretty good. And the other 50%, it's not that they're not going to get there, it's just that this month they're not there. Compare that to the 15% we talked about 45 minutes ago. This stuff really does work. Okay, next slide, please. So how do you begin the conversation? And this first bullet is so important. And this gets at stigma and all the other things we've been talking about. Please don't assume that having a mental health diagnosis or showing symptoms results in a person not being able to work. I'll give you a quick example of this one. Back when I was in college, I used to work in Manhattan, in New York City, at what was known as the General Post Office, which is now the Moynihan train station, if people are familiar with Manhattan. It's across the street from Penn Station. It was a massive post office where virtually all the mail in New York City came through. I worked on the midnight shift boxing mail one summer as a college kid. Easily half of my coworkers had a very clear, significant mental health issue. Easily. Highly symptomatic. It didn't matter for that job at all. There are some jobs it might have mattered for. For that job, it made no difference whatsoever. So I learned very young that having a diagnosis doesn't prevent somebody from having a really good job. And these jobs paid a ton of money. So don't assume, which means you don't have to worry about diagnosis. You don't have to worry about, does this person have a mental illness or not? You just don't have to worry about that. You basically can treat them like as anybody else. You want to ask the person about their hopes and dreams concerning employment. Once again, this is right, the empowerment, as well as their understanding about their current options. You want to ask the person about the strengths that they bring into the job search, their past experience, their talents, their interests, their credentials, as well as jobs that might be interesting to them. You also may want to ask the person about any challenges that they may be concerned about. And if the person identifies with a mental illness, provide information about options for disclosure. And there's a whole process that can be used to help people decide whether they want to disclose. And ask about their preferences. Now, if you look at the bullet 2, 3, and 4, that's probably similar to what you do with anybody else, right? Probably no different. Disclosure is an important issue, and as some people are writing in the chat box, it's a double-edged sword. In some settings, it can prove difficult. In other settings, it actually is welcome. And if the person's looking for accommodations, at some point it'll become very important as well. This is how to begin the conversation. If we can move on to the next slide, please. So let's summarize what we've covered so far. People diagnosed with mental illness are often interested in employment and capable of finding and keeping meaningful jobs. There are a great many untrue myths about people with mental illness. Many. We just did 2 slides worth of them. And we probably could have come up with another 5 slides. Stigma and self-stigma can get in the way of employment. Recovery is possible. People can and do create meaningful lives, often including employment. And as Lisa is going to show you next, resources and referrals are available to you to support your efforts. Let me stop here and see if anybody has any questions before we move on. If so, please type up in the chat box. Christina, thank you for your comment there about keeping an eye on previous strengths and accomplishments. It's such a huge task to change the view of so many people. Yes, and it's not, Miriam, it's not your job alone. It's all of us, and it takes a long time. And it's better than it was, 20 years ago, but it still has a long way to go. Any other questions before we move on? Okay, if not, Lisa, we turn things over to you.
Okay. So this portion of today's information is going to be talking about how you can refer somebody for mental health services. So I know there were a lot of questions about if I'm working with somebody who has a mental illness and they need help with that, what do we do? Where do we go? How do we connect them with people? And so we want to talk about some of the OMH programs that are available so that you can connect people to a program that would be appropriate for them and whatever their situation might be. So Paul talked a little bit about PROS already, which is the Personalized Recovery Oriented Services. And it is a program that focuses on comprehensive recovery oriented plan for adults with serious mental health conditions. And they focus on achieving and sustaining goals that are related to employment, housing, education, socialization, community connections, etc. So their focus is on goals. And primarily, they teach life skills and help people connect to community resources to promote that independence. They are primarily site-based, and there are group and class-based models that they operate under. Services can also be delivered in the community via telehealth as well. And anybody can make a referral to PROS, including a self-referral. So as you're thinking about or working with someone who might benefit from this type of mental health program, you can just pick up the phone and call one of the programs directly, or the individual can be a self-referral for those programs. Interested individuals can tour the program and try out groups or classes under what's considered a pre-admission. So that would be, a great possibility for people. There are lots of other programs though. So we want to talk about something called state aid funded employment programs. And there are several different types of these SAFEP programs, but they are primarily for people who are 18 years old with a serious mental illness. And they also include young adults 18 plus who have been served through New York State education. So if they're in high school and they have an IEP, they also may be eligible for a state aid and funded employment program. Individuals who are unable to perform job tasks without ongoing and sustained job coaching should be redirected to another job in which they can successfully manage the work tasks independently, or referred for intensive employment supports through Access VR. OMH-supported employment services are not intended to provide indefinite and ongoing support of job tasks, but they are intended to mitigate psychiatric barriers related to employment. So it might not be something that can happen ongoing for a long time, but it is something that can address those psychiatric barriers directly related to the employment issues. The referral sources include, but are not limited to, community providers, Access VR, BOCES, school districts, single point of access, shelter outreaches, forensics hospitals, lots of different ways that referrals can work for the SAFE-AT programs. The provider should establish a verification protocol to confirm program eligibility. So if you're interested in connecting someone, you can connect to a state aid funded program and talk about the eligibility for that specific program and how that individual could benefit from that program. One of the state aid funded programs is called Assisted Competitive Employment, or the ACE program. And this program offers short-term pre-employment services followed by ongoing supported employment to provide mental health supports to those seeking or working in competitive integrated settings. It's often called the soup to nuts model, where they can do everything from pre-vocational work to job placement and follow-along supports. And it is oftentimes an alternative to Access VR participation. They're able to fully implement IPS, as Paul mentioned, IPS, individual placement supports, and it's the most progressive or modern form of the state aid funded programs. And it's typically very flexible to meet the individual needs. So the ACE program is a great program for individuals to get the supports that they need. Another state aid funded program is called the Ongoing Integrated Supported Employment, or OISE services. And these services provide extended mental health focused employment supports related to helping sustain employment for individuals who have achieved job stability. These services often follow the Access VR intensive services. So after Access VR has helped someone get a job and the individual has been stabilized in competitive employment, typically the agency or a vendor of Access VR can pick up these additional intensive services to provide the OISE supports for the individual. It's used to support other individuals in competitive employment, but admission for these coming from Access VR is prioritized. So if someone's already with Access VR, this might be an option for someone to get the supportive employment follow-along services that they might need. Another state aid funded program is called the Transitional Employment Placement. And this program model primarily arranges trial work or volunteer experiences for career exploration and skill building before providing ongoing supported employment for those individuals whose mental health has been a barrier to attaining employment. So there's a lot of different types of things that they can do, but it's internship style, short-term placements. Job is typically owned by the program, similar to a clubhouse model of transitional employment. And the emphasis would be on helping people and then graduating them to competitive employment. So it's a transitional employment placement program. There's also affirmative business and industry and transformed business model supports. And both of these program models must be a self-sustaining community business that is operated by an OMH provider and hires individuals that receive mental health services to work within that environment. The work supervision and mental health supports are provided by different staff on the provider agency. But again, it could be seen as more of a temporary model, transitioning that individual into competitive employment. There's also a work program model for the state aid programs, and this focuses on vocational assessment and job training, and then hires individuals for transitional or long-term paid work in institutional or community job sites. So the work program staff work with the employee to help manage their mental health related behaviors that might otherwise be a barrier to them having employment. There are other services that OMH provides. One is called a Community-Oriented Recovery and Empowerment Program, and it's also known as CORE. CORE is a person-centered recovery-oriented model of behavioral health supports, and it's designed to build skills with self-efficacy, that promote community participation and independence. And the eligibility for core services are enrollment in a health and recovery plan, so a HARP program, or an HIV special needs plan, or even a Medicaid Advantage Plus plan. And then the recommendation should be by a licensed practitioner of the healing arts. So someone can refer them and have a recommendation by a licensed practitioner of healing arts. There are 4 main services that CORE offers. There are the empowerment services, which are related to peer supports, the psychosocial rehab, which Paul mentioned earlier on, psychosocial rehab and identifying goals and person-centered goals that they might have for their future, family support and training, and community psychiatric support and treatment. So there are 2 of the 4 core services can assist individuals with employment goals, and those would be the psychosocial rehab and the empowerment services or peer supports. So psychosocial rehab is skill building and psychoeducational interventions that are provided through psychosocial rehab and used to support attainment of person-centered recovery goals and valued life roles, including employment. So they don't have to just be about employment. They can have any goal that they want, but employment is certainly able to be included in this particular service. They can help identify employment goals and develop skills to overcome the barriers to employment goals. The empowerment services through peer supports are non-clinical peer-delivered services that can promote skills for coping with and managing behavioral health symptoms during the employment process. So they are typically non-clinical peer-delivered services with a focus on rehab, recovery, and resilience. Paul also mentioned earlier employment first. So we are a New York State employment first state. And in line with the principles of employment first, CORE provides an opportunity for individuals to work on employment goals in tandem with associated services. So CORE and IPS can add additional support to psychosocial rehab for employment goals, but it does not replace psychosocial rehab services. And currently there are 8 designated providers with a funded position that focuses on IPS employment. So one of the things that we want to talk about is how can you make a referral? So these are considered referral options, and there's no wrong door. So that's something to remember. There are a lot of different ways that you can refer someone for services, including the individual making themselves a self-referral. The care coordination, hospital inpatient units, a therapist or a doctor, through their health plan at work, family and friends, self-referral, and a housing provider. So these are all areas that referrals can come into the CORE program. And communication and collaboration between referral sources and CORE providers are going to facilitate the process and support the individual's engagement in services. And there is a list of designated CORE services and providers by county, and services can be found on the website. And just to make a note, you will be getting a copy of these slides, so you will be able to have all the information that Paul provided and some of these resources that we have on this slides. So I know that there's been some comments in the chat, but I want to also go through some of the resources that are available as well. If you've not had a chance to experience any of these other resources, you might want to check them out. There's New York Connects, and if you use the search term mental health clinic and enter the specific county, you'll be able to get some information about opportunities, available programs for people to check out. Also, finding a mental health program clinics using our OMH page and using the advanced search. You can also find various programs through that OMH advanced search option. And this is just an example. There are lots of other programs that will pop up, but if you're looking for general support, there's something called a Certified Community Behavioral Health Clinic, or CCBHC. They also can do some things with employment, so that might be an option for individuals. Another program subcategory for outpatient is called MAHODERS, which is really mental health outpatient treatment and rehab services, and it's related to our clinic programs. We also have the PROS program that we talked about before, which are comprehensive PROS with or without clinic treatment. So it depends on what the individual needs as to what kinds of things you'll find for that person. Additionally, the local mental hygiene department system in your county, called the local governmental unit, or LGU, is also an option for you. The mental health clinics that we just talked about, the MAHODERS and the CCBHCs, are often first entry points for local mental health services and should be considered along with other service options that best meet the presenting needs and may offer a quicker access. And there's a link there to find a mental health program. We talked about single point of access for adults, and if you contact the local mental hygiene department, New York State Conference of Local Mental Hygiene Directors, that will give you some more information about what's available. And individuals receiving mental health services or consultation by providers that are not regulated, certified, licensed, or funded by OMH, and who could benefit from services available through the public mental health system. So that's another option for individuals to look at. There's also the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI, and that is an agency that helps not only the individual who has a mental illness, but the families and the advocates for people. And it is a statewide, and there are local agencies that provide regular meetings and availability supports for people. We talked a little bit about New York Connects, so I'll just go on to the next slide. Next is 988. If you are experiencing difficulty, someone is experiencing some symptoms, outright symptoms, and need immediate crisis intervention, 988 is free and confidential and available for individuals at any time. Sometimes people want to chat or text or talk on the phone. So there are options for all three of those things. And it's a good idea to encourage people who are experiencing emotional distress, suicidal thoughts, substance use crisis, and or abuse. So that would be another great resource for people to participate with. Okay, and so now I think we should open it up for any questions. Any questions about the information that Paul presented earlier, and any questions on the OMH programs or how to get connected with them?
I'm looking in the chat box and I see one question about what's considered serious mental health. I guess that probably came up when describing the various programs available. You know, I think generally it's diagnoses including schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, significant depression, serious personality disorders. There are other diagnoses as well.
And yes, Ken, you are going to be getting a copy of the PowerPoint. So please put your name in the chat so that we can make sure we get a copy of it to everyone who was attended.
And here's another question. Are these services available to folks in all areas of the state, especially rural areas?
That's a great question. And I would say you need to check the OMH website for find a program, and that will give you your best option to locate one. If you have trouble locating one and you want to reach out to OMH, please feel free to reach out to me, and I would be able to connect you with someone who can further direct you to find the appropriate program.
I see an interesting comment here from Patrick. Well, this is a good start. It would have a greater effect if it was available for businesses as the stigma still exists on their end and with their workforce. And I can speak to that a little bit. When we train employment staff at these various programs like PROS to go out and meet with potential employers, part of the discussion can be, often is, around issues related to stigma. So that's one thing. The other thing that we hear time and time again, and this is all anecdotal, it's not I can show you data, is that there are certainly employers or potential employers who have concerns about hiring people with serious mental illness diagnoses largely because of the stigma and the myths. But there are also a significant number of employers who want to be hiring these folks, perhaps for personal reasons, perhaps because of family experience, those sorts of things. So it's not an automatic assumption that a job candidate who has a mental health problem or a diagnosis won't have an open door. We hear increasingly of employers who actually want to support them. Is there a list of Access VR focal points that can be contacted by region?
Access VR? Yes. You could go to the Access VR website, adult education, and there, if you look for district offices, that will give you a listing of the office by region of New York State, and you can start there.
Other questions? Any of this strike you as, gee, I don't buy it? Anybody want to raise a point that you just don't feel comfortable about that we can speak more about? Or on the other hand, are there things here that resonate and kind of validate what you've been thinking and doing? It's interesting how employers view a veteran with the same diagnosis so different as a random citizen. That's probably true about some employers. Well, the IPS model has been around for quite a while. Most local practitioners I encounter are not familiar with it. That's true. Is there data on how widespread this practice is across the state? So here's what I can tell you. Each of the, I think it's 70 plus PROS programs provide the service. There are about 40 clinics run by the state facilities that are providing the service. There are a small number, about 8 or 10 core PSR services that are doing this across the state. Also a similar number of these OISI services that are. At this point in time, we're working with over 120 assertive community treatment or ACT teams, some of whom are up and running, others who will be in the course of the next months or year or so. And I know CCBHCs will in time be providing this as well. So it's a lot that's out there. And Lisa, I think on your list, you have some other kinds of sites as well.
Yeah, we work with a lot of different providers that operate IPS services across the state. So it is, and it's known as the evidence-based model for supported employment. So moving forward, it should be one of the go-to models to help people with employment services. So we are seeing a lot more participation with it. And I know we have a training coming up in the next few months for DRCs at Department of Labor on IPS, kind of a refresher, annual refresher training. Okay.
Do all of these resources require the diagnosis to be documented? It's a great question. And I guess the answer, Lisa, would be it depends upon the resource. So for a PROS program, for example, or a state clinic, yes. For the others, I just don't know.
Okay, any other questions before we are finished for today? Did you feel like this was helpful information and that it answered some of the questions, anxieties, or worries that you expressed when we first got started? Do you have anything related to that you would like to share? Yes, Yasmin, it looks like you have a hand raised. Can you go ahead and unmute yourself? Paul, can you unmute Yasmin? And Ken raised a hand too. Okay, let me stop sharing.
Yasmin saying, I'm sorry, I'm having some technical issues with my computer.
Okay. Okay, Ken, let's see, request unmute. Okay, Ken, I think you're unmuted.
Yes. Regardless, I'm usually all throughout the day I'm unmuted, so I'm very
Okay.
used to it. But I wanted to say, I have a lot to say, but I'm not gonna. I mean, I only have so much time. I've done this for many years. I started working in the mental health field when I was 18. I'm 65 years old now. I worked for North Shore LIJ Hospital in Nassau County for 26 years. A bunch of different things I've done. Um, Now I'm working in the Department of Labor, and we have the Scion grant to run our program on from New York State. And that is a process whereby you're working with New York State. So if you're working with somebody as a person in the Scion situation, they have to have some kind of documentation, or they have to indicate that they have their mental health issues, and that's also documented in the OSOS system where you put your notes in on that. So if anybody's asking about documentation, if you're on the Scion grant, then you have to do some kind of documentation that the person has, that there's some kind of medical documentation that the person has that. And if you go to work with Access VR, they're definitely going to have documentation, because that's like the first thing they ask for. So I would err on the side of not too much caution, and kind of be aware that you're probably going to need documentation for the person in order to work with them in almost any capacity.
Okay.
And now I'm going to unmute.
Okay, thank you. And let's see if we can get Yasmin. Don't see Yasmin on the list anymore. Are you still on? Anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask? Okay. I don't see Yasmin anymore, so I can't unmute that person, but let's see what else we have here. Question, can we find out if a client is receiving SSDI? If, so oftentimes the DRCs, so Disability Resource Coordinators from Department of Labor, are certified benefits advisors. And they can sign, the individual can sign a release so that that disability resource coordinator could reach out to Social Security on their behalf, or the individual can call Social Security or stop by their local field office to find out if, sometimes people aren't sure if they're getting SSI or SSDI. So that might be a place to start. But usually it goes through the individual, so you'd have to have a release from the person to actually reach out. And yes, I want to respond to Scott, perfect for or an integrated resource team. So one of the hopes over the years is that the individuals from the Department of Labor are creating integrated resource teams for the individuals they serve. And OMH would absolutely love to be a part of that. So if an individual is receiving mental health services from an OMH program, we absolutely would want to be a part of that resource team. So thank you for bringing that up. Okay, I think that's it. Is there any other questions before we go? I think that was the last thing I saw. Okay, well, thank you very much for attending. We're very happy that you all joined us today. We hope you have a great afternoon and thank you again. Have a good day.
Thank you, everybody.